This episode discusses sensitive topics, including miscarriage, stillbirth, and death. Please be advised.
Welcome to the Mamatoosa podcast. I'm your host, Atoosa Benji. Well, welcome, my friend. It's so good to have you on the Mamatoosa podcast. Thanks for agreeing to be my guest. I say this to so many of my guests, but it's so true, is that you really hold a special place. I really look to you as just a woman of grace and dignity and wisdom and kindness, awesomeness. You have that awesome sauce.
You're going to make me blush.
It's true. I'm not saying that. So officially welcome.
Thank you.
Why don't you tell me a little bit about how you and I met, and then in what capacity you and I have worked, and then we'll start our conversation from there.
Okay, so if I remember correctly, we met because we have a common friend. My best friend, her older daughter, and your daughter were in the same class growing up. As we started doing birthday parties, and as you guys were friends anyway, maybe not from the same synagogue, but from the same school and from the same class. And as we would do different events, we just got to talking. I don't remember like one specific moment where I was like, oh, I know Atoosa, but I do remember that you were there for a very good amount of time while I was in Los Angeles. That's like the basic story of how we met. Yes. And then we started to become at least more acquainted with each other and better friends and working partners when I became a surrogate. I obviously knew you were a doula. That's like one of the big things that everybody knew. Atoosa Benji was the doula to go to. Oh, and for my first 3 pregnancies, I did not have a doula. I really wanted one, but we could not afford one at the time. And so when I was a surrogate, knew that I'd be able to afford having a doula, I immediately said not only to my husband, but to the surrogate parents, I am going to hire Atoosa. I hope you all don't mind because that's my decision. And I called you and I remember you said, keep in mind we are friends. So I just want to make that known, obviously, that as a doula and as your friend, I'm certainly here for you. But as long as you're comfortable with it, I'm comfortable with it. And I think that that made a very strong impression, not just on me as a surrogate and somebody to work with you, but also as I went into my own doula profession, because of the fact that you really made it clear that it's always up to the client. Whether you think you're going to be a good fit for the person or not, it's really up to the client to decide because they're the ones in the vulnerable position. I knew that even though, and especially because we were friends, that I wanted you as my doula when I was giving birth to the surrogate baby. I think that was the best birthing experience I had had out of all 4 of my pregnancies.
That means a lot, really means a lot. Were you douling before you and I?
I was not.
You were not. So you started your doula career afterwards.
I did. After I had the baby, that was in December of 2019. We were actually supposed to start, I don't know if you remember this, we were supposed to start our doula class at the middle of March, or like the very beginning of March. And we were the first DONA class that had to be pushed onto Zoom. And we didn't start until probably June.
Yes.
Because we had to figure out all the specifics and how it was going to work and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, 2020. Yes, it was a year of juggling.
Oh, yeah.
For sure. It was a year of juggling. So I thought you had already been supporting people a little bit in the community before you decided to go full force.
Well, I wasn't supporting people in birth, but I have always loved everything to do with pregnancy and labor and delivery. Since I was, I don't know, probably 12 is as far back as I can remember. The person who worked very closely with my mom used to babysit for me when I was like 5, 6 years old, and she had gotten married and got pregnant. And I just remember with fascination watching her belly grow and seeing the baby move. I wanted to be in the delivery room at 12 years old. Obviously, that was a little inappropriate. After she had the baby, I was one of the first people that held her newborn daughter. And I was there the whole time as a mother's helper as her daughter was getting older and older. And every week when my mom would go and work with this person, I was there sort of as a mother's helper. And I just knew I loved all things to do with those topics. And so when I became a surrogate, I think that was sort of my bouncing off point, because I call being pregnant my superpower. And then I was like, okay, if I'm a surrogate, that's helping a family. I can't really be a surrogate for the rest of my life. So how else can I help women? And especially in this time where they can be vulnerable, it can be scary, it can be all the things of unknown. If I already know so much, then that's sort of what led me into saying, well, I should be a doula. Why not?
And that's the classic birth worker story, is the calling. It grasps you and it pulls you in. I think that birth work is not for everybody. For those of us who are able to do it and have the privilege to do it, it calls and calls and calls and calls until you answer in one way or another. Every educator, doula, midwife, person I've spoken to has been like, I don't know, I just got this crazy, I had to be in the room, I had to be holding a hand, I had to be wiping sweat off a forehead, I just had to be there. And I remember obviously being called to watch birth with my grandmother. That was what we did together. It was our superpower. Anything that gave birth, we were in. My cousin was having a baby, and I remember being outside the hospital doors as a very young adult, and they closed the door and wouldn't let me in. And I was like, I need to be there. Do you not understand? Open the door. I have to be there. And I felt the same way when I watched an educator teach a group of doulas, or I think it was expectant parents. I was like, I need to be doing that. That's my job. You're doing my job. And the first time I watched a midwife put on her gloves to catch a baby, why do you have my job? That's my job. No? So I always know when I get that feeling of like, that person's doing my job, that's what I need to be doing. I really understand that calling part of it. You and I shared this extremely powerful experience. Tell me what brought you to deciding to be a surrogate. Such a big decision after having your own kids.
It was actually something that I had thought about before even having my own kids. One of my best friends from growing up when we were in college came out of the closet to me, and without even thinking about it, when he said it to me, I said, if you ever want me to carry your baby, I will. And he was like, you've never even been pregnant. How do you know that that's even going to be possible? I said, I have no idea. I just know that if you ever need me, that's what I want to do for you. And he said, okay. And we sort of left it. He's still a good friend of mine. He has not had children yet. One day, I don't know if I'll be able to be a surrogate, but the offer is still there. And when I met my husband, I had told him about this conversation, and the first thing he said was, I love that you want to help other people, but can we have our own children first? And I said, of course, that's not even a question. I, of course, want my own children. And it turns out that as a surrogate, you actually do need to have your own children because the doctors need to know how your body handles pregnancy and labor and delivery.
Right.
When I got pregnant with my daughter, who was my first, it just felt so easy. Every time somebody would talk about the aches and the pains and the nausea and, you know, all the things that people say come along with pregnancy, I kept thinking, I don't really feel any of that. I mean, I just kept looking and thinking, I'm growing a human. So I guess aches and pains are sort of going to come with it. And I didn't really think that it was painful or that it hurt. You actually said something to me I think it was in the doula class and not necessarily when I was in labor, but you said there's a difference between pain and there's a difference between suffering. And I think that's sort of how I looked at pregnancy, where I thought, okay, I'm in pain, but there's no way I'm not suffering in any way, shape, or form. I actually find this kind of cool that my body can do all of these things. After my first, I got pregnant fairly easily with my next two. And again, the same experience. I had very easy pregnancies, very easy labor and deliveries, at least, you know, normal. There was nothing in an emergency. I didn't have to have a C-section. I had never experienced a pregnancy loss. Things sort of just happened. And so I felt like, if it was so easy for me to be pregnant, how could I not then do that for somebody else? And I started looking into it to make sure that it was something according to Jewish law that I could do. So thankfully, in terms of talking to all the different rabbis, surrogacy was something that does obviously happen in accordance with Jewish law. It was a gift beyond measure that I feel like I got, even though I'm the one that gave birth.
Kelila, first of all, shout out to Penny Simkin, who's up there resting in heaven and watching all of us. Hi, Penny. Penny is the one who taught me the concept of pain versus suffering, and she talks about it at length in her books and in all of the literature that we have from her, which is very eye-opening because I feel like women suffer so much in all sorts of capacities all around this world that pregnancy, labor, and delivery are just sort of encapsulated into that suffering or the belief or the messages that we're given as women that, you know what, you're going to have a baby, it's going to suck, your body's going to change, you're never going to be the same again. In between those bylines is you will suffer. And some of us do.
But it's also, it goes back to so much else where you hear your whole life and you see, TV and movies depicting labor as this intensely painful thing, but you're not getting the full scope of the picture, and you're not understanding, okay, it might look painful on the outside, but is that person actually, like you said, are they suffering?
Right. Are they suffering? And how much propaganda have we been fed as women from a very, very young age that you will give birth on your back, you will scream, you will curse at your husband, which not all people have husbands when they're giving birth.
And not all people get angry with their husbands either.
Correct. Then some person, typically male, middle-aged, with a long white coat, will come and rescue the day, which is such bogus. And I feel like when midwifery was sort of gently or not so gently taken from the hands of women, these were the images that were replaced. So we are laying powerless in the most vulnerable time of our lives on our back, which, by the way, no mammal lays on their back to have a baby. None. Nope. They might lay on their side. They may stand up, but they don't lay on their back because that's the most vulnerable position for predators. And typically, a lot of trauma happens to women while they're laying on their back. So it's not an organic position for us to hold. And the notion that the man in our lives, if we have a man in our lives who's called our husband or our partner or our baby daddy, is going to be a complete powerless ball of nothingness standing in the corner wringing his hands while another man comes in and rescues the day. It's just fascinating to me how we've had imprints and imprints and imprints of that since we were little girls. And the men have too. The men have too, honestly.
Because we've all been taught that pregnancy and labor and delivery is something that's medically wrong with you, whereas it's something that's so miraculous and beautiful. If you know your body, you know your body. And that's not to say, look, I'm not saying we should all be going out in the field and working and then birthing our babies and continuing on with our life. There is some monitoring you should make sure that you're getting with a midwife, a doula, somebody who at least knows birth a little bit. But it's not this horrible medical procedure. So many times I heard my husband say, oh, don't pick that up, you're pregnant. And I was like, and what happens when I have our first and then I'm pregnant with the second? Am I not allowed to pick up our child? Like, none of this makes sense.
Right. I think it's all fed into that weakness, powerlessness that will ultimately be the fabric of women. All in all. Right. I have never, my husband's like, you can literally start a conversation with the doorknob. Everywhere we go, I start a conversation. I just love people. Kelila, I've never met a person who meets a man and says, I want to be a surrogate before they have even gotten to, let's have our own kids. Let's talk about babies. Let's make a baby. It's just incredible that you had that calling, which my podcast is full of incredible people, as you might know already, with Kelila being one of them. But wanting to be a surrogate being like a topic of conversation, it's just wild to me and amazing. I remember coming to your house during one of our prenatal visits, and you had a stack of papers on your desk. I think it must have been 500 pages. And I was like, Kelila, what is that? And you were like, oh, that's the surrogacy contract. And I was like, how does somebody even get through that? Never mind the legal jargon. I cannot. So tell me more about getting into an application to be a surrogate, meeting the family, lawyers, compensation. And I'm going to be very ignorant and blunt and possibly not kind with this question, although my intention is not to be kind. But how do you get compensated for your body, your life force? To be a surrogate, you're giving your life force. The oxygen in your blood is oxygenating another human that you are not going to raise. How do you put a value on that? How did you make sense of it in your mind?
So fortunately, the surrogacy agency and the lawyers are all very well versed with this, for the same reason that you can't put money on paying somebody for a service if you're getting divorced and you need to figure out where your children are going to live and for how long and all that kind of stuff. There's certain things, I think, to me that make a lot of sense that you can charge for. And then there's other things where you think, okay, thank God somebody came up with a value system for this, because if it was up to me, I would have no clue where to start. So thank God for external factors in that. Let's go back, I think, to the beginning, because I think it'll make a lot more sense as it progresses. So in order to become a surrogate, you obviously need to have the surrogate. You need to have a couple or a person who wants to have a baby. And there's a few different ways to go about that. Some people decide to do it completely on their own, which is pretty difficult. And some people go through a surrogacy agency. So I happened to find a surrogacy agency at this family fair that we went to that's over by the LA Zoo every year. And they have different booths for all different sorts of things. My youngest at the time, I want to say, was only about 8 months or so. Maybe he had just turned a year. I went up to the surrogacy booth and I said, "Hi, I have a few questions." And they were handing out those little like squeeze balls. It looked like a purple egg. And she said, "Oh, you must need a new squeeze ball." Yeah. And I said, "No, I actually don't need a squeeze ball. I don't even remember if we got one. I really have questions for you." And she said, "Oh, one of your kids probably lost the balloon." I said, No, I really have questions. I want to be a surrogate." I think she almost jumped over the table and gave me a hug. So we set up a time to talk because it was definitely going to be an extensive conversation. Okay. And we spoke a few days later on the phone for, I think, about 2 hours. And it really went into all the details of, okay, what does it mean to actually be a surrogate? What are my requirements? What is the couple or the person going to ask of me to do? How does the contract get set up? How does the compensation get set up? How does the lawyer end up working with both of us? Things like that. Mm-hmm. And so once I figured out all those things, I realized specifically as a Jewish woman that I need to work with a Jewish family. Any baby that I birth is Jewish. And so according to Jewish law, I can't just give a baby to a non-Jewish couple. So I worked with an agency that specializes in working with Jewish couples in infertility. Mm-hmm. And they matched me with a couple where every step along the way, it really felt like I could feel the hand of God in how we were matched and how we found each other in the connections that our families actually had from before when we weren't even around. First, we met on Zoom and we had an instant connection. And the next day they said they wanted to fly out to LA since they didn't live there and they wanted to meet me in person and meet with me and my lawyer.
Got it.
At that point, I knew the lawyer that I was using. She was actually my daughter's Girl Scout leader and she's a family practice lawyer. She's fantastic. She does everything from adoption to surrogacy and everything in between. I knew I wasn't paying for her, and she knew that I wasn't paying for her. She knew she was going to be compensated by the parents. Okay. So whenever we met, I don't know how she kept track of her hours and how she ended up billing them. The couple is in charge of all of the legal fees, all of the medical fees, and everything that goes along with it. We ended up meeting at a restaurant. It was a very funny situation. When the couple walked in, I wear glasses that are by Tiffany. It's not the same pair that I was wearing a few years ago, but I love Tiffany and I love the glasses that I have and had. And the husband commented as he sat down, "I know that you see my wife isn't wearing glasses. She wears contacts, but she has the same exact pair of glasses." And I was like, wow, that's crazy. Nobody has the same exact pair of glasses, but that's cool. And then we started talking and they said, "We saw in your application, your birthday is July 25th. I said, "That's right." They said, "Well, my wife's birthday is January 25th, which is exactly 6 months after my birthday. She was born a few years before me, but it was always so funny that we were half birthday twins." Mm-hmm. And then all these other things kept coming up. We just made this instant connection. And as I left with my lawyer, we said, we had a lovely conversation. And as I left, I said to my lawyer, "I love them. I think they're phenomenal. And I would be so honored to work with them." And they said the same thing. We ended up kind of going through the process. It took a few months. I remember at the very, very beginning of talking to somebody about surrogacy, they said, it happens very quickly. Mm-hmm. And this was already at least a year into the process. And the whole time I kept telling my husband, they kept saying surrogacy happens very quickly, but this does not feel quick. This is already a year later, and I'm just now connecting with the right couple. So, okay, I'll take your word for it. If you mean quick, then I don't know what exactly that stands for, but sure. But then once we started going through the contract and everything was signed, that's when things happen quickly. And that's where I think setting that standard in my head was a little bit of a disconnect. But going through the contract, you said it was, a very, very long document. I don't think it was quite 500 pages. Massive. Yes, it was massive. And it really goes into everything that could possibly go wrong, because unfortunately you're dealing with money, you're dealing with life, you're dealing with a lot of very sensitive topics that people don't usually talk about. Some of which includes, what happens if in the course of pregnancy I lose an ovary? What happens if I lose the use of my uterus. What happens if I have to have a C-section? What happens if I have a miscarriage, a stillbirth, anything in between? And the contract has to go into each of those things because God forbid something happens, we need to be prepared. And my lawyer was really fantastic. She went through with a fine-tooth comb every single detail. She made sure that I was okay with all the wording. She made sure that I was okay with exactly how payment was going to work. She made sure that I was okay with even things like what happens if I'm on bed rest and I have to have a cleaning person, or what happens if I have to have somebody come in and help take care of my kids? How much would the couple be paying for? I mean, literally everything that you could possibly imagine was in that contract. Once I signed the contract, I had to get it notarized. We sent it back to the couple. They had to sign and get it notarized. And it went back and forth, I think, 3 times, just to make sure that all the wording was correct for me and all the wording was correct for them. They had their own lawyer. I had my lawyer. The lawyer spoke. From there...
And you also had Frank to discuss things with, right? He had to be okay with this too? How did that all work?
He did. I mean... So part of that was that we both had to go through a psychological evaluation to make sure that we were both on the same page. So while, yes, he did have to be involved in the lawyerly discussions, it was more like, okay, Kalila's really in charge of this one. I'm just here to offer any sort of background notes. He certainly understands legalese better than I do. So for him, he flew through the contract and he was like, yeah, it all makes sense, and didn't really have anything to add. Whereas I was like, okay, I need to really sit down with my lawyer and go through everything, explain what this means and talk about this and what is that. So yeah, he was involved in the whole process, but it was really more as like an, okay, I approve, just tell me where I need to be and what I need to do, which thank God he's very easygoing in that respect.
You sign the contract, you begin the process. I'm assuming it's in vitro.
It is. And so you have to go through basically what an IVF patient goes through. So you start on Lupron, maybe, whatever the drug is that stops ovulation. Okay. I was also put on birth control to make sure that they could monitor exactly when I was supposed to be ovulating and when the lining of my uterus was thickening up, because the whole idea with IVF is that you're tricking your body into thinking that you're pregnant before you actually have an embryo implanted. That process was about a month long, where they added certain prescriptions and they started adding in certain estrogen patches and certain progesterone shots. They scheduled me for, I want to say it was a weekly update so that I could go in and have an ultrasound and basically check the thickness of my uterine lining and make sure that as we got closer to the date that they wanted to do the IVF procedure, that everything was looking like it should, because just in case they could push it off by a day or two, or they could boost it up by a day or two and make sure we were all on the same page. We went in and everything was looking great. We set a date and they thawed out 2 of the embryos. They implanted them, and ironically, the first time they implanted both embryos, I went back in for a blood test a week or 10 days later when you're supposed to essentially find out if you're pregnant, and it came back that my HCG levels weren't rising. I might have been more upset at that point than the parents, because they had already been through loss after loss after loss and disappointment after disappointment after disappointment. And this was the first time I had been told that everything looks great and, oh, by the way, you're not pregnant. And I remember getting off the phone. The mom was the one who actually called me because she got the phone call from the doctor's office first. When I got off the phone with her, I was sitting in the car. My kids had gone inside after we had gotten home from something, and I just started sobbing. And I remember my husband came out to see, the kids are inside. How come I didn't come inside? And he found me in the car just crying my eyes out. And he said, is everything okay? And I said, the pregnancy didn't take. And he said, let's take a breath and see what the next steps are. It's so funny. He's always so logical and I'm so much more emotional. Definitely balance each other out in a lot of good ways. But that was the first time that I thought, okay, I just need to be patient and I just need to take a breath.
Kelila, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. Were you crying because you felt responsible for this not happening for the parents, or were you crying because your body had gone through all of this and now it didn't take? What were you feeling?
I was feeling like this was my fault. I thought I had 3 perfect pregnancies, and this time the doctors were supposed to know everything there is to know about getting pregnant. Why didn't it work? Obviously, it's something wrong with me. It took a lot of just talking through it to understand that, well, yes, the doctors do know a lot. They don't know everything. And it really is up to God. And if those embryos were supposed to come into this world, then it would have taken. It wasn't that I was upset that I wasn't pregnant. I was really upset that I felt like I had failed them, that they had put all of this effort into me and I should have been able to do it. So why couldn't I? And it was the first experience I had with loss.
I have to bookmark that now too, because again, spoiler alert for the listeners, I can't imagine you having had this feeling of such loss and disappointment and what was to ensue.
Yeah. And I wasn't even pregnant yet, really. I mean, it was a lot at that moment. Wow. So fortunately, things happened fairly quickly because I remember calling the doctor and saying, okay, what's the next steps? Like, when can I go back in for the next IVF procedure? And they said, well, we need to make sure that everything's cleared out of your body. We need to put you back on the regimen of birth control and the estrogen patches and the Lupron and the progesterone and everything. And then we will set another date when we see that your body is reacting the way it should. And fortunately, I think it was maybe a month or two later. It really wasn't that long. I'm pretty sure that the first transfer was the end of January and the second transfer was the middle of March of 2019. So I really didn't have to wait very long, which was very fortunate, I feel like, for my own mind. And the second time, again, they put in 2 embryos. I mean, we did all the things. Everybody was like, oh, if you want to get pregnant, you should eat the core of a pineapple, and you got to make sure you do bed rest, and you have to make sure that you eat French fries, and you have to make sure that you do that. And I literally, every midwives' tale, I was like, give them all. I'll take all of them. I will do all the things. I just want to help this couple and get pregnant. I could have had twins. I could have had triplets because they kept saying, these embryos sometimes split. With IVF, that's very likely. Ironically, I just had one implanted very firmly. The other one sort of, I guess, was absorbed into my system. When we found out I was pregnant, they checked my HCG levels the first few days, every other day, to make sure it was doubling and making sure everything was looking healthy. And then from there, it was really interesting the way that the pregnancy progressed, because people always ask me, wasn't it weird your husband didn't come with you on any of the appointments? To me, it was like, no, it's not my husband's baby. First of all, we didn't get pregnant in what would be considered a normal, quote unquote, way to get pregnant. So it's not like I was like, yeah, my husband and I are having a baby. No, this was like a very scientific, I knew logically from the start, this was not my child. And so every time I would go in for an appointment, whenever I would get an ultrasound, I would immediately take a picture and I would send it to the parents. I would call them as soon as I was done with the appointment. They really had very open-minded ideas as to how our relationship should work. And they felt like as long as I was comfortable with it, they were comfortable with it. But the one thing that they really were insistent on is every time I went into the doctor, they did not want to hear from me until they heard a heartbeat. So every time I would hear the heartbeat, literally the first thing I would do would be to text them like, all is good. And then I would call them after the appointment. I was due right after Thanksgiving of 2019 to make sure that we sort of covered both sides. They came out right before Thanksgiving, giving me, that normal 2-week window of saying like, okay, if your due date is this date, let's go 2 weeks before and 2 weeks after and make sure we're covered. Same thing as a doula and a midwife.
Yeah.
And they were on call essentially for whenever I went into the hospital, as were you. and I remember calling you so many times because I was feeling contractions basically on a constant basis, but nothing was progressing. And again, we tried all the things. We did the walking and the saffron. I remember you saying at one point, I thought it was really funny because especially in doula training, one of the things you say is baby goes in a certain way, baby's got to come out. And the same way happens to be true that it starts labor. And I thought, I don't think that's going to work for this one because that's not how the baby was made.
Right? Exactly. This is not how that baby was made. It's so fascinating that you were so clear about the line of my body is doing a project for someone else. Mm-hmm. And the fact that you were so clear about not having expectations or needs from your husband to be, that supporting, coddling, pregnant, hugging person during this process, the whole thing is wild. It's almost like dissonance, right? From like the marriage and the body that made your babies, that are the babies that you made with Frank and you birthed and you are now raising. And then the body that made this baby that was going to be raised by someone else. I can't stop marveling at how you so beautifully had that boundary.
Thank you. I think it says a lot about Frank. it really
For
says a lot
sure.
about Frank too, because
For sure.
even when I was pregnant with my own, I'm not a cuddly, touchy-feely type person, and neither is he. So he was definitely there for me in all the ways I needed in terms of talking things out. I'm a very logical type person. I think I said that before. And I remember at one point towards the end of the surrogacy pregnancy, like I looked at him and I got this very concerned look on my face, and he said, "Is everything okay?" I said, "I think I'm just getting worried that I've been growing this baby, and what if I'm attached to it? And what if when I do birth the baby that I'm afraid to give it back to the parents?"
Right.
And he said, "Well, let's think about this. First of all, you knew going into it that it's not your baby. So remember that," which I was like, "You're right. And the baby, the way it was conceived, obviously was not the same way that I conceived my own." I had that thought in the back of my head. So it's not something that I didn't think about. It's not like there was definitely a clear boundary and that was it. But it helped to think about it, and it helped to logically plan it out. And I think one of my favorite things, first of all, I'm a huge Friends fan, the show. And so when Phoebe had the triplets for her brother, I was like, I want to do that. And I think that's what I kept going back to. And every time somebody would say, "Oh, I didn't realize you were pregnant," and I would be like, "Oh, it's not mine." That was my favorite thing. And the look on people's faces when they were like, "I can clearly see you're pregnant," was that I thought it, right. I thought it was hysterical. So
I love that.
I think that
mess with their head a little bit. Sometimes
right?
when I'm with my half sister and her mother, I'm like, "Hi, this is my sister, and here's her mother," and they're like, "Wait, what?"
Huh? Right. And I think there was one time that was my all-time favorite when that happened was we were at a Havdalah service, a separation after Shabbat,
Yeah.
and there was a band that Frank and I had gone to see as one of our first dates, who also then played at my wedding. I knew them very well. One of the band members came up to me. He was performing at this Havdalah service, and he said, "Oh, I had no idea you were pregnant." I said, "Oh, yeah, it's not my," and I was very clearly like, this was almost at the end of the pregnancy. I said, "It's not mine." And then he looked at Frank and he was like, "What?" And Frank's like, "Oh, it's not mine either." Right. It was fun. And I think like the more we just enjoyed it, it was hysterical.
I love it. It's truly a mitzvah project.
I don't know, because of the fact that, like I said before, I just felt like being pregnant was my superpower. I didn't think that it was anything out of the ordinary because I thought my body can grow babies. Like that's what I happen to be good at. So this is just another baby that I'm growing for somebody.
And you had a beautiful pregnancy. You had a beautiful labor and delivery. And I can say that objectively because I was in the room and watched you do it. There was a clause in the contract that said that you're not going to be given the baby once the baby is birthed.
Yes and no. There was a request that the baby not be put on me. And I think actually I made that request because I didn't want to be attached to the baby when it came out. I really felt like if I held the baby, I'd be even more attached because that's what happens when you birth your baby. They put it right on you. In that moment, I remember, and my doctor was amazing. I know that there's a lot to be said about different doctors, but I really had one of the most phenomenal doctors in all of Los Angeles.
He is lovely. Should we shout him out a little bit to our listeners?
Dr. Payman Benouni. He's phenomenal. He was at 3 out of the 4 of my labors, and I couldn't have asked for anybody better.
And very compassionate and very client-centered.
Yes. And I remember discussing with him before I went into labor. I said, if possible, I really don't want the baby put right on me. And I guess, it's just one of those rote memory things. And as a doctor, the baby came out and he just put the baby on me. And looking back on it, it was actually the better thing to do. And I'm really grateful that it happened the way that it happened, because I remember looking down at the baby and thinking, he looks nothing like my family, nothing like my husband, nothing like me, nothing like my children. He looks exactly like his father. And in that moment, I was like, I am totally fine with this baby going with his parents, because I knew that that was not my child.
So you have to wonder then what happens at the hormonal level. Because as a midwife, I'm all about that underlying primal hormone level, which is when we give birth to our own biological baby, when that baby looks familiar to us, does that immediately begin the bonding process because there's familiarity? And in this case,
I think it's
where you were like, you know what, this is not my baby, doesn't look like us. It's almost like you were inherently not bonding. It wasn't just your head, it was your body too.
It was all of it. I think that it was the mindset and it was the hormones, because I knew that I was giving this baby nourishment, but I also knew it wasn't my baby. thank God I've never been put in the position where I've had to think about adoption, but that could be the same way for an adoptive parent, where for somebody who knows that they're giving birth and they're giving their child up for adoption, in your head, it's a disconnect of saying, I can't carry this child. I can't raise this child. I don't know what else to do. And I want this child to still have a life. And so when the baby's born, maybe that's what makes it easier to be able to say, this baby's going with its adoptive parents and I'm okay with that.
There's just so many things at that baseline primal level physiologically that are happening. It's maybe something we'll never know, or we'll know, in a few years how all of those things work. Was it difficult for you? I remember when the biological mother obviously couldn't feed the baby breast milk. You were not going to feed the baby breast milk, and the hospital was frantically looking for a breast pump, which somewhere in the communication had gotten lost that we actually needed it in labor and delivery and not in the postpartum. And I remember it felt like an eternity before your breast pump came. What were your mind and your body doing?
I think at that point, I just wanted to make sure he got fed, and I wanted to make sure that it was not with formula as much as possible, because I think that's where my hormones started to kick in, where I wanted what was best for him and I wanted to be able to provide that. So you're right. I think it felt like an eternity until they actually brought the breast pump to the room. And I remember you teaching me how to hand express, and really, thank God, when the baby's first born, they just need a little bit of colostrum to be able to nourish themselves. Their stomachs are so small that much is okay. And I remember being able to literally get into a teaspoon that we then poured into a syringe, and then walking the syringe over to where the parents' room was, because it was down the hall from mine, and being able to be like, here's what I could just hand express out. Whatever he eats, let me know if you need more and when. And when they finally did bring the breast pump, to be able to, even then, I remember saying to you, like, I can't pump colostrum into a bag. What do I do? So we just would pump it into a very tiny little syringe until my milk came in. And I really didn't pump for very long. We weren't really sure how it was going to work at that point, and that was probably the only thing that was up in the air in terms of where the contract stood. I knew that I was going to be compensated for as many weeks as I could pump, but we also didn't realize that it was a lot harder than we thought, because once they left LA after the baby was stable and everything looked good, I mean, I think the baby was 2 or 3 weeks old when they left and when they went back home. And at that point, I had to send milk across the country. And it's just not feasible to be able to do that constantly. FedEx, the post office, whoever you're using, charges a lot, and you have to make sure that you have dry ice, and you have to make sure you freeze it properly, and you have to make sure that it stays frozen.
Job,
and
just pumping for yourself, never mind going to the post office to ship it.
Right. After about a month, we both decided, myself and the couple, I was going to try and have my milk dry up, and they were going to find milk with somebody closer to home, which they did, which I'm very glad that they could. And for the amount of milk that I had left, I ended up donating the rest of that to somebody else who either had adopted, or I don't remember her whole story, but I had posted it somewhere in the LA mommies group. And I said, look, I was a surrogate. I have extra milk that I'm willing to donate. If somebody wants to meet me at this location, I can give you a whole cooler full when I'm done. I met this woman in the parking lot in a safe place just to make sure that it was really a person who needed milk and not somebody who was trying to get into my house. And I gave her a whole cooler full. And that was that when my milk dried up. So that part of it, in terms of the hormones, the only hard part was that every little step felt like a big monumental ordeal, where first, when the baby wasn't in the room with me, I was like, oh my gosh, it was so easy to just nourish the baby and grow the baby, and that was it. Now I have to worry about getting them milk. And then once we left the hospital, again, it was that big monumental step of saying, oh my gosh, we're not even in the same hospital anymore. Now I have to worry about actually, how are they going to get the milk? And then when they left LA, then it was that final step of saying, like, okay, I can't see them whenever I want to.
It's incredible, Kelila. So you're now, what is it, 3 years out or so from the first baby?
It was 2. So ironically, and it's funny because at the time I didn't think this, but with COVID, I remember you saying in recovery, you need to let your body rest at least a year, if not 18 months before you start again. And in my head, I'm thinking, 18 months? That sounds crazy. That's so long. But ironically enough, COVID then hit and 18 months was no problem.
Right. And you knew you wanted to surrogate again for the same family, right?
Oh, yeah. In labor, I remember saying to the husband, when are we doing this again? And he looked at me like I was nuts, which probably most people would look at me like I was nuts. I waited until January of 2022 until I got the okay that I could do it again for the same couple. And then in May of 2022, we had finished contracts. We had gone through, I started medication. And this time I'm actually in Florida now. So I had moved cross country and it was a little bit different. All of their embryos were still in Los Angeles. So I knew I was going to have to go back to LA for any transfer. I did all my medication here in Florida. I had a doctor here in Florida. I had a special IVF doctor here in Florida that was going to do all the checkups post-transfer. I figured out a way to get out to LA. We made a whole family trip out of it. That was in and of itself an ordeal, which was very funny, but that is neither here nor there. I did bed rest in LA for 2 or 3 days, and then we flew home. And at that point, I was going in once a week. Yes. Well, at that, we weren't sure if I was pregnant. I mean, I flew home after the IVF transfer, and then I would go into the IVF doctor that was here in Florida to start any blood tests and see exactly how my HCG levels were rising and all that kind of stuff. So same process, just a little bit different because I was in a different state.
Right.
And every week I would go in, they check the baby's heart rate, they check to make sure that the position where the placenta had attached was growing normally. They, all the things to make sure that the baby looked healthy, and everything was looking great. And I graduated from the IVF doctor, I think at the end of July. I was supposed to then go see my regular doctor at 12 weeks to really graduate into the regular OBG practice. Everything looked great. I went in, they did an ultrasound, we heard the baby's heartbeat, and then he said, okay, come back at 16 weeks. Everything should be fine until then. We'll see you in 4 weeks. And I went home, 16-week appointment. I was 16 weeks and 5 days, and I took my kids with me because I thought, as did we all did, that I was going in to see a healthy baby with a heartbeat moving around. That was not to be the case. There was no heartbeat and there was no movement. And with my 3 kids in the room, I found out that I had lost the baby.
Oh, Kelila. Had you felt the baby move at all?
I thought I was. I even remember saying to the mom the day before, I know that the baby's healthy. I'm having really hardcore aversion symptoms. My daughter had made a bagel on lox and took it in the car when I took her to one of her homeschooling programs. And I remember telling her she had to put it back in the plastic bag, and I had to open up all the windows because I was like, I am going to throw up. I cannot handle the smell of this lox right now. And the next day was when I found out that the baby was no longer with us. This doesn't make sense. How is this possible?
So you have the kids with you, Frank's not with you, and now you are obviously in shock, I can imagine.
Yeah. At that point, because I was already over my first trimester, they couldn't just let me go home and say, when you have the miscarriage, you'll have the miscarriage, just keep us posted. They actually had to put me into labor and delivery. So I somehow made it home. I do remember trying to call my best friend, who's our common friend. I remember I had to leave the parents a message because they were both in a meeting. And they called me as I got to my front door. And I remember putting my hand on the door and seeing their phone call, just answering the call. And I couldn't even say anything. I just started sobbing. I don't remember if I collapsed right in front of my door or if I somehow made it inside. But I do know that my husband was right there and just guiding me into our bedroom. I don't even remember what I said, but something along the lines of, the baby's not there. And the mom kept asking, what do you mean the baby's not there? And I said, I went to the appointment and there's no heartbeat. And then she started crying, and then I was crying even harder. And I still have to think about getting my bag packed to go to the hospital because they wanted me to go into L&D, and figuring out what to do with my kids and my husband and just all of the logistics of everything that was going on. And it was the first time I felt completely helpless. Like you said, I was in shock. I was in shutdown mode. My whole body was just, my brain wasn't working. My thoughts weren't working. I didn't know what to do.
Yeah, it's like your frontal cortex shut down, right? And so now I'm thinking about what you said originally about, did those feelings begin?
All the things in the contract.
Immediately? How fast did that start coming in? Or were you just purely like, okay, I have to birth this baby, and we'll think about all of that later? Or was that just roaming around in your head?
No, at that point, it was really, I have to go to the hospital and I have to birth this baby. And what is that going to be like? And how am I going to get through it? Am I going to make it through alive? I mean, all the things, all the questions, everything from what did I do wrong? How did this happen? It's totally my fault. Maybe I should have taken extra prenatals. Maybe I should have, maybe I skipped a day and I forgot, or maybe I shouldn't have eaten something, or maybe I should have eaten something, or maybe I shouldn't have walked around Disney when it was 100 degrees, because we live 20 minutes from Disneyland, from Disney World, and I'm there all the time. Maybe I didn't drink enough water. Literally all the things that I didn't even think about the contract at that point. I just knew that I had to go to the hospital and birth this baby.
It's so hard, Kelila. My heart is just melting. I wish I could have doulaed you through that. If you were in LA, I would have been there in a heartbeat.
I know.
Tell me about the process. So they actually had to put you into labor, which involves Pitocin induction of labor at that point. And how long did the whole process take?
Yeah, it was Pitocin and misoprostol. I went in, I want to say it was a Tuesday or a Wednesday. I think it was a Wednesday. I went in the afternoon. Frank was actually with me at that point. Our kids were with a friend of ours. Frank came in. I said, can you just make sure they do an ultrasound one more time? I was in complete disbelief that the baby was no longer there. And I remember looking at him and saying, do you see anything? And the ultrasound tech kept trying to shield the screen. And he said, they won't let me see anything. I said, do you see any movement, anything? Are you sure that there's no heartbeat? And literally for 20 minutes, she was in there making sure that the baby really was gone. The doctor came in, they started Pitocin and they started misoprostol. And they gave me until the next morning to see if my contractions would start and to see if I would really go into labor. They gave me, I think, 3 doses of misoprostol throughout the night. And then I had to take one orally because it wasn't contracting fast enough and it wasn't making me dilate fast enough. I ended up taking it orally. And at that point, they did warn me that there was a lot of really horrible symptoms that came with it, including nausea and diarrhea. And my husband had gone home at that point because I knew I wanted him to be with the kids as opposed to with me. And I could not have gone through this without my nurse. I feel like I had 2 nurses. One's name was Sharon and one's name was Angela. I only remember those 2 names because my best friend's sister's name is Sharon. And I kept thinking, she's squeezing my hand like I know my best friend would be. And I just kept picturing my best friend standing next to me. And the other, Angela, I just kept saying, like, she's an angel.
She's an angel.
I would not have been able to get through it without them. Between their shifts, thank God one was coming back.
God bless the nurses out there.
One was coming.
They just don't get enough love.
Totally. 100%. And I actually went back afterwards and gave them both thank you gifts because they really did make all the difference in the world to me. With that, informed consent of saying, I know that there's going to be these extra symptoms. I remember all of a sudden the nurse wasn't in the room and I had to go to the bathroom. But it felt like when you're in labor and you have to poop, but you know that the baby could be coming. And the next thing I know, I had gone to the bathroom all over my lower half and I started sobbing and I pressed the nurse's button and it stunk horribly and it was awful. And she just kept calming me down and saying, it's okay. We see stuff like this all the time. It's fine. Don't worry. We'll wash you up. We'll clean you up. And it was like the embarrassment and the pain and everything that was going on and losing the baby. I just was sobbing.
Yeah.
All of it.
And the family...
They chose not to be here in the moment. First of all, it would have been a very last minute flight. It probably would have been very expensive. But at that point, there was really nothing they could do. And I don't know that they wanted to see the baby. And I don't know that they wanted to be in the hospital. They had already gone through so much of their own loss that this was just another one to add to it. And I think that they were both so traumatized by that, they couldn't put their trauma on me. And I didn't want my husband to be there because for the same reason I didn't want him to be in the labor and delivery room the first time when I was having the first surrogate baby. I felt like he needed to be with my kids and just assure them that everything was going to be okay, no matter what happened. I kept going back and forth. And in my head, I actually said this out loud. Once I birthed the baby, it took about 24 hours from the time that I was first admitted to the hospital until I actually birthed the baby. And the doctor said to me, do you want to see the baby? And I said out loud, the doula in me does, but the mom in me doesn't. And she said, well, I'm going to leave the baby here on whatever, I don't know, I don't even remember what it was in. But if you want to see the baby, let me know. And I called her back in and I said, I want to see the baby. And so she did show me the baby. And it was like, I'm grateful that I got to see him. But at the same time, I wish I didn't. I'm glad I did, but a mixed emotion. And then it was even more trauma because my placenta had not fully detached. So I was starting to excessively bleed. I needed to go in for an emergency DNC. And I think out of everything, that was the hardest part because I had just heard from a woman in my community that the previous year she had had a healthy baby, but a part of her placenta had stayed behind and she ended up being rushed back into the hospital also for an emergency DNC. And she had said to me in that moment of getting rushed into the hospital, she was like, God, this is not the way I'm going out. I have kids at home and I cannot be taken out by this. And that was my thought as I was being wheeled in. The anesthesiologist said to me, you have a choice of being in twilight or you have a choice of being completely knocked out. I said, please knock me out 100%, but please make sure I wake up. And as I remember closing my eyes, I just said, please, God, this is not the way I'm done. I have 3 kids at home and I cannot not be there for them. And I just kept repeating their names in my head and my husband's name in my head. And when I finally woke up, again, thank God for my nurses, my one nurse, Sharon, literally had my phone ready for me to call my husband. And so I could immediately talk to him in recovery, which was, I don't even think that was in the hospital policy, but I'm so grateful she did that. And then I was released on Friday to be able to go home. So I was in the hospital for 2 full days. I almost had to have a blood transfusion. All the things that could go wrong felt like it could go wrong. And then at that point, once I got home and I started going into the recovery mode, that's when I started to look back at the contract and say, wait a minute, there's a few things in here that we need to figure out how to close out the contract and how to finish payment and figure out exactly what's going to happen. But unfortunately, and this is where the story sort of goes sour, the parents really wanted nothing left to do with me, and they let the surrogacy agency and my lawyer do the rest of the negotiating and the rest of the talking, and I never heard from them again.
So the last contact you had with them was when you called them to tell them the baby was no longer viable?
Yes and no. The last contact I had was when I was being released from the hospital. They did call me to check to see how I was doing. I couldn't really talk. I was so devastated for us all together. And I just remember crying on the phone with the mom while I was sitting in the hospital. And then that's the last time I spoke to her.
I feel like I can't breathe. I'm so moved by your story and the fact that you went through everything and then had a postpartum hemorrhage just as a cherry on top, right, of this very, very difficult story. I know that midwives often will say that the womb will cry, that the uterus has its own psychobiome. I've seen very experienced midwives, actually when someone is having a hemorrhage, while they're doing all the things, so they are setting up antihemorrhagics and doing IVs and considering next steps to stop the bleeding, because women can bleed out very, very quickly and essentially pass in the postpartum period because of a hemorrhage. So they will literally say to the womb, I need you to stop crying right now. I promise we're going to talk about this once you stop crying. And I've seen it work, which to those listening, especially the healthcare field, if you're an OB or you're a nurse and you're listening to this, rolling your eyes going, that is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. I want to tell you again that we are doing all the things. We are doing the Pitocin. We are doing the Cytotec. We're doing the Methergin. We're setting up the IVs, putting in fluid, making sure this person lives. There is a part to this story where the womb cries for either what happened with this.
And the energy behind it and the intent, the intent behind putting forth your energy to save that woman and to basically, like you said, talk to the uterus and say, I promise you are being heard and we are here for everything. Let's take a pause and let's stop for a second. And you're right. It's the energy behind it. I 100% believe is really the way that people get through anything that they've been put into.
Part 1, tell me how you coped and what you did to recover emotionally, physically, spiritually, and how that propelled you into your podcast and all the work that you do around loss.
I cried. I let my emotions out. I talked to some very wise people who said, do not hold this in. Don't be afraid to show your kids your emotions. And I did. I cried a lot. For the first 2 weeks, I really felt like I didn't leave my bed very often, and my kids would come in and snuggle with me and bring me food and bring me tea and coffee. And my daughter, especially, who was 11 at the time, even for months later, anytime I would get upset, she would say, are you okay? Do you need a hug? Is this baby related or is this just regular crying? And so she was really moved by what was happening. And I did a lot of research. I wanted to know everything there was to know, as I think most doulas and midwives do, about the process, right? We wouldn't be midwives and doulas if we didn't. And I thought, I had never experienced this. I want to know what other people go through. I want to know how other people heal. I know the tools that I've been given, but are they really going to help in this situation? And I put together a workbook called the Pregnancy Loss Grief Workbook that included all of those tools that I found to be helpful. Coloring, journaling, writing, screaming, crying, throwing a pillow in my face and just screaming as loud as I possibly could without having to worry that I was going to upset the people around me to muffle the sound. Being able to rip pages and tear them up and literally burn them if I wanted to. So anything I found helpful, I tried to put in there. Obviously, I'm not licensed in psychiatry or psychology, so every step of the workbook says, if anything becomes overwhelming or if you feel like you can't handle this on your own, please consult your physician. I felt like even just birthing the workbook to start was a huge help. And then from there, being able to talk to other women, being able to hear from other people who have experienced loss, not just in miscarriage, but in stillbirth and in infant death and child loss, I realized in speaking, I've had over 50 episodes now of my own podcast called Pushing Through Loss. The one thing that binds us together is that we're all experiencing the same trauma. We all have so much more in common than we think, and you're not alone. So to be able to really find comfort in the fact that other people can, while they might not have experienced the same exact thing, they can really understand where you're coming from, and we're all just trying to be okay in the world.
And that's truly the fabric of women. All
Right.
of our stories that intertwine, doing very, very, very difficult things. Did you have a ceremony around the baby? Did you say something to him? You said that as a doula you wanted to see him. As a mom you didn't. Can you tell me a little more?
Thank God I was connected with a group called HEAL, HEAL, in Florida. And it's run by a psychiatrist whose wife actually had a stillbirth at, I think, 32 or 34 weeks. I don't remember, but very late in the pregnancy. And so he fully understands exactly where each of the couples or moms are coming from. And this group of women truly helped me get through that first few weeks. We had a meeting every single week for 7 or 8 weeks. It was sort of like AA, but for pregnancy loss and for child loss. And then on December 6th, every year, which is sort of an interesting date because that's the date that I gave birth to the first baby, there is a ceremony called the Angel of Hope ceremony. And it's actually international. It happens in many locations around the country, as well as in other countries around the world. And it's based off of a book that a man wrote that's a fictional story about a woman who lost a baby and who erected a statue in their memory. The people that read it felt so connected with this story, they actually contacted the writer and they said, "Where is this statue?" And he said, "No such statue exists." And they said, "No, we have to have this statue." So the very first statue that was erected was in Salt Lake City on December 6th. I don't remember what year it was, but it was sometime in the 90s. And so ever since, various different other locations have put up their own memorials called the Angel of Hope. Every year, we all get together on December 6th and we have a ceremony for all babies that have been lost. I've gone now twice, and it's a time that I know that I can be around people who have been through the exact same thing that I've been through, and I can cry without worrying that someone's going to judge me or that someone's going to think, "But it wasn't even your baby. How could you be so upset?" It doesn't matter. Every single person there has lost a baby in some way, shape, or form. That has been extremely, extremely helpful in the years moving forward.
Kelila, if the couple was sitting in front of you today, what would you say to them?
I'm sorry. I don't know. There's not a whole heck of a lot I think I could say. I know it's not my fault. Sometimes my head and my heart don't always agree. Yeah, just I'm sorry.
You're incredible.
Thanks. I probably have a lot more I'd like to say, but I wouldn't.
Yeah. I can imagine just the slew of the thoughts and the feelings, the restraint, but then the not restraint, and somewhere in the middle. Somewhere in the middle.
Right. And I say to my kids, and I say to really anybody who I talk to, one of the best pieces of advice I've ever been given is I can only control my own thoughts, my own speech, and my own actions. However the parents have chosen to respond, I can't do anything about that, and I can only respond how I know I would going forward. I really do, from the bottom of my heart, wish them nothing but peace and wish them nothing but long lives. They have 2 children, one from another surrogate and one from me, for as long as their lives will be. I have no animosity towards them. You know, the whole situation and how it ended, of course, makes me sad, but I can only control how I react moving forward. And that's the only thing that I can give to the world, is my hope and my faith, and just to know that I'm doing the right thing.
And what would you say to someone who's thinking about being a surrogate?
It's worth every step of the process, every up, every down, every heartbreak, every challenge. If you like being pregnant, it is one of the most amazing gifts you could possibly give. And it's one of the most blessed things I've ever done.
What's so miraculous about this whole process is that every time you carry a child, you carry that child's DNA within your DNA for the rest of your life. So the DNA of both of those children will be forever with you, as well as the energy of having held them inside of you for as long as you did. Thank you so much for honoring me with your presence today, for your incredible story, for your being in this world and being in my life and in the life of so many other people who you're helping. Incredible is what's just the only word that's coming out of my mouth right now, is incredible. I have a tremendous amount of love and awe for you. I just wish you the best as you continue on your journey. I know that you are going to help many, many, many people. Thank you.
Thank you. And the feeling is mutual. From the moment I got to know you, I knew that you were an incredible person, and I'm honored to be on your podcast.
Thank you, my love. Thanks for listening to the Mamatoosa podcast on the Industry Plant Podcast Network. Mamatoosa is hosted by me, Atoosa Benji, and produced by Josh Stretton Carlson. Chris Agnew is our audio editor, and our theme music is composed by Mary Lalazarian. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider leaving us a review and subscribing. See you next Tuesday.